Hi Gary, I'm Tina Quizon,
Hi,
Pathways to Paradise. My show airs on Olelo. This has been 7 decades of several fuel spills. What is in the works to stop any future leaks?
That's a very good point. And you're right, these tanks at the Red Hill facility, there are 20 of them. Each one has more than 12 million gallons capacity. 2 are already shut down, so there's 18 that may be functional at any given time. The Navy tries to keep 15 in operation at any given time for their purposes of fueling their ships and facilities. And since the 1940s, when they were constructed in top secret conditions, and through the 1980s into the early 90s, when the facility was top secret, we have very little evidence or very little public information about what may have spilled previously. But we do know that each of the 20 tanks spilled a little. We do know.
Now, are you folks going to be releasing the records of the actual chemicals that have been spilled over the last 7 decades?
What we have tonight, and that is freely available to you and the public, is a chart of information that we, the Department of Health, have gleaned from the Navy reports that show the amount of spill that was reported and the year that it was reported for each one of the 20 tanks. I don't put a lot of faith in those numbers, in that the control over those tanks, the monitoring, and the regulations back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s basically did not exist.
Well, and it seems like it still doesn't exist because they're exempt from EPA. I mean,
No,
it's a whole...
It's not true.
Okay, but they don't have to do like Exxon, and they don't have to have the double liners.
Okay, so we can talk about that.
So how are we going to prevent future leaks?
Okay. Tina, that's an excellent point, and let me get to that. So to be clear, the law does apply to these tanks. The law doesn't fully apply the same way that it would to your neighborhood gas station with a double line tank.
Right. This is even more serious because these are even bigger tanks.
Right. These tanks were built in place, and they were built 70 years ago. So the modern law that would require a double-lined tank in your neighborhood gas station does not apply to these tanks. But that's exactly what the Department of Health is pursuing here. We believe that the latest technology needs to be applied to these tanks so that they will not spill, and so that if there is a spill, it's not a amount of guesswork, but it'll be definitively known as to how much may have spilled. And that's what modern technology provides.
Well, why haven't, since the 80s at least, I mean, we've been so-called advanced technology for decades. Why has the Navy not put in place actual things to monitor, and so that we know there's an actual leak?
Okay, let's be fair to the Navy. I want to be fair. They have invested a lot of money and a lot of time and a good number of careers in these tanks. Department of Health is not saying that the Navy has been irresponsible. They have invested in rehabilitating the steel in the tanks. They have a method of measuring the fuel that they claim can get down to a 1/16 of an inch.
But that's not what we heard when the January leak. We were told a tape measure, that it was an eyesight measurement. And I mean, honestly,
Right.
that is not a modern technology. That's not anything more than the boy sticking his finger in the dike to stop the leak.
Okay, well, it's a bit more than that, but I will agree with you that that there are systems that could be applied on top of what the Navy currently has. They're doing, I think it's fair to say, they're doing the best they can with what they have, and they have upgraded their facilities over the years.
But I don't believe that's enough when you got 20 tanks with 12 million gallons of fuel. This is serious.
Right.
This isn't just a candy store. This is hazardous materials.
Okay, so I love your question. That was a statement, but I'll take it as a question. So the situation is very serious. These tanks are 100 feet above groundwater, and we know that contamination from previous spills, not this January spill, from previous spills over the last 70 years have contaminated the bedrock below the tanks and has reached the groundwater. What we're trying to determine now is how large that contamination is and where it's going. But to get to your point, how do we prevent future leaks? If this facility is going to remain functional and in place, then I believe, as you have stated, that the U.S. government, through their Navy, has the responsibility to put the best possible control and containment technology into those 20 tanks. Now, here's the problem. It's never been done before. These are huge tanks. There's nothing like them on the planet, and nobody has ever, to our knowledge yet, installed modern leak detection and double lining the way you would have in your neighborhood gas station.
But yet these tanks are surrounded, our neighborhood is surrounded by the tanks. So even more pressing.
Obviously, this is a pressing question, which is why we're here tonight, to inform the public of what's going on and what we hope to go on into the future. To double line these tanks, in one hand, it's not rocket technology, because this is the sort of standard operation that any modern fuel tank is going to be double lined. If you buy one today for your corner gas station, you're going to have to use that double line technology. But yet, as we stand here today, nobody has applied that kind of double lining technology to tanks this large or in this configuration before. So where that's a goal, where I would like to go, I can't say right now that you can go to this consultant or this engineer and buy this product and make it work.
But yet these tanks are still functioning every day, so the threat is there.
The threat, so long, even if they're double lined, even if they're brought up to modern standards as what I would call the standard of your corner gas station, there's always a threat that they will leak. And so you're quite right that so long as they exist and they're full of gas, we can minimize that threat to our groundwater, but it will always exist so long as there's gas in those tanks.
Okay. You had spoke a little bit about the plume. Do we know what direction it's going, how deep it is, and what is going to be, are there going to be fines for this?
Okay, so a lot of what we're doing with the Navy right now is to try and identify how large the contamination is in the groundwater beneath these tanks. And again, this is contamination that existed prior to the January spill.
Well, also the soil.
So let's start at the top and work our way down. We know that under 19 out of 20 of these tanks, the Department of Health and the Navy, working in the past decade, have taken core samples of the rock beneath these tanks, and in 19 out of 20 of them we find petroleum staining. So we know that only tank 10 did not have stained rock beneath it, but we have evidence of reports from the Navy that tank number 10 also leaked. So we know that beneath the tanks, virtually all of the tanks, petroleum has sunk into the bedrock. You have about 100 or 80 feet between the bottom of these tanks and the groundwater. That groundwater we've also sampled, working with the Navy over the past decade. We've drilled down monitoring wells but directly beneath these tanks, and we find petroleum product in the groundwater. So we know it's there. Now the next thing is to figure out where it's going and how much of it there is. And that's why the Navy is putting in additional groundwater monitoring wells, working with us to identify the best place to put those. We would like to see at least 3 wells north of the facility and at least 3 wells south of the facility to characterize how large and where the plume may be moving. And if we find something with those wells, we may have to drill more. But that is the work that's ongoing, and it's going to take time to do. It's just you can't do it overnight.
Now, there's an actual tunnel that runs from the tanks. And at some places, that tunnel is very close to the water table.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the assurances that we're not going to have more fuel? Because there are reports of the tunnel having leaks, and your water table is right there. Okay. So what's the procedures? I'm glad you've been
doing your homework. These are good questions, and you can go in and get some answers to them if you haven't yet. So you're quite right that the tunnel that goes beneath these tanks runs downhill. Ultimately, it goes right to Pearl Harbor, and that's the tunnel from which the pipelines empty the tanks and fill up the battleships. Along the course of this tunnel is a drinking water well, which is the Navy's Red Hill shaft. And I think what you're referring to is if there were a catastrophic release, let's say a pipe underneath one of these tanks were to burst and all 12 million gallons were to fill in that access tunnel and flow downhill, it could immediately go right into a drinking water well.
Well, it could
That's the
also
Navy's well.
create a fire. It could explode.
Sure. So the Navy, put it this way, the Navy has studied that concern previously and has taken a number of actions to prevent it. So that there's more to be done.
Okay.
But they have put in, and I've been there and I've seen them. Okay, so they have some bulkheads in the tunnel that they could close in case the tunnel were to be, filled with oil. They could stop it. There's more that they need to do to make that oil tight, if you will, and to protect the drinking water source. So we're not done with that yet, but it's an issue that has not been ignored.
When will the public start to be notified? I mean, because literally, doesn't the tunnel run somewhere through?
It runs right down over there about 100 yards.
Yeah. So there's houses near this.
Oh, there's houses, and there's freeways, there's streets, there's everything right above the tunnel.
So you have a lot of people in the community that are worried that the stall to notify the public and that so is there an emergency plan in place?
If there were a catastrophic release? That's a good question for the Navy. I will tell you that we've been informed that the Navy Fire Department or the military's fire department drills and is prepared for a fire or a release from the tanks. I'm sure it's part of the contingency plans.
12 million gallons.
Well, I'm not going to say that.
I mean, if we had an earthquake, I mean, there's
Sure.
So is there an emergency preparedness plan?
That's a question that's best for you to ask the Navy.
But so
their
far,
facility.
the Department of Health does not have one from the Navy?
I can't answer that. I'm not sure.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I look forward to hearing more information. And you were saying the documents are starting to be released with all the different chemicals and...
Well, the Navy has been giving the Department of Health quarterly reports on the monitoring results of the wells that are directly beneath these tanks. That's public record.
Okay, but there was some, from what I had read, that the gap was the reports did not get to the Board of Water Supply.
I'm not sure. You'd have to
Okay.
check with them.
Okay.
And there's lots of different reports out there. There's 70 years of reports on Red Hill, so what I'm saying
Will
is
the Navy be fined?
Possibly. What the Department of Health and the EPA and the Navy are working on right now is a legal agreement, a consent agreement that will map out all the actions that need to take place to prevent future spills, to respond to this spill, to monitor and to gauge the groundwater movement. And all of that is going to be negotiated all the way up to the Pentagon. And that agreement, should we succeed in closing the deal, will have specific timelines as to what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, and when it needs to be done. And those requirements will be enforceable potentially by fines if the work isn't done as stated in the agreement.
Have you spoke to Secretary Hagel about any of this?
I have not.
But he's in the loop, or because he was just here.
In the terms of the Department of Defense loop, that's a question for the Navy.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for your interest.
Thank you.